Should Australia let criminal non-citizens stay if they've spent most of their lives here? The government's more lenient rule is now being hardened up after serious offenders were allowed to remain. It's been another political headache for Labor over immigration. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. The Immigration Minister survived a bruising week in Parliament over a rule he introduced last year known as Direction 99. It was written after pressure from New Zealand and required a person's ties to Australia be weighed alongside community safety when deciding whether to deport questionable characters. All week, Parliament heard examples of paedophiles, rapists and other serious offenders who were allowed to stay as the opposition piled on the pressure. The government hit back with details of crooks released from immigration detention on Peter Dutton's watch. But Labor knew it was in trouble. And while Andrew Giles is being kept in his job for now, Ministerial Direction 99 will go.
Order.
Community safety remains our highest priority as a government. Community safety remains the highest priority of this government. Community safety, community safety, community safety.
An adjustment to our immigration laws made a year ago is tonight proving a headache for the Albanese government.
Among those to have their visas reinstated, people convicted of
hitting a 3-year-old disabled toddler in the head,
punching his wife so hard he split her eyelid,
possessing images and videos police described as at the most extreme end of child abuse material.
Different cases, different alleged crimes, all had visas cancelled, but overturned on appeal using a new criteria.
It's not working and it is making the Australian community a less safe place.
The decisions made by the AAT here, in my view, at first blush, do not meet any community standards that I'm aware of.
Anthony Albanese needs to sack Minister Giles, needs to do it today, and you need to repeal and revoke Direction 99 today.
The department had promised to alert the Minister of problematic cases.
We have failed to do that in a timely way.
Doesn't that absolve the Minister of complicity?
No, it doesn't. He signed that ministerial direction and then went to sleep at the wheel. That is why he should hand in his resignation to the Prime Minister.
Under siege over a litany of crimes committed by foreigners, the Albanese government's made a snap decision to abandon a controversial legal order that's allowed dozens of non-citizens to avoid deportation.
That directive was at the behest of Jacinda Ardern. That directive, tonight, is gone.
I will be updating Ministerial Direction 99.
Does the Prime Minister still have confidence in the Minister for Immigration?
I do, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister returning serve.
On this bloke's watch, 1,300 hardcore criminals were released from immigration.
Convicted sex offenders, murderers and accessories to murder.
No curfews, no ankle bracelets, no monitoring.
The Prime Minister was the architect of Direction 99. He did it as a commitment to Jacinda Ardern. He's put our country at risk.
And my guest this morning is the Minister for Agriculture and Emergency Management, Murray Watt. First, let's check what's making news. Sharing deepfake pornography will attract serious criminal penalties under legislation to be introduced to Parliament this week. A deepfake is an altered image or video of a person's face or body, and under proposed laws to be introduced by the Attorney-General, sharing deepfake sexually explicit material without permission will carry a penalty of 6 years jail. Officers from the People's Liberation Army have confronted Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles over Australia's criticism of China's military build-up. The ABC's Monty Bovell reports the Defence Minister used a speech to the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore to call out China over recent confrontations with Australian forces. PLA members present took issue with elements of the speech, and Mr Marles met with his counterpart on the sidelines of the summit. In News Corp papers, James Campbell reports a former immigration detainee who broke visa conditions has escaped with a suspended sentence, despite the Immigration Minister saying any breaches of curfew and reporting obligations would attract a mandatory minimum sentence of 1 year in jail. And finally, one from me. Josh Frydenberg is considering a return to politics at the next election after a draft redistribution changed the electoral boundaries of his old seat of Kooyong. Under proposed boundary changes released on Friday, the seat of Higgins would be abolished and parts of it moved into Kooyong, currently held by Teal independent Monique Ryan. The Liberal Party's already pre-selected 30-year-old Oxford graduate Amelia Hamer for Kooyong. It's now up to the Victorian Division's Administrative Committee to decide whether to reopen the process due to this redistribution. Now, while there is some support to bring back the former Treasurer, the committee is understood to be evenly split, with others wary this could be seen as pushing aside a young woman. We'll come to those draft boundary changes and the prospects of a Josh Frydenberg return. We're going to begin, though, with the latest immigration headache for the government. Its own ministerial direction about who should be allowed to stay in the country is now being hastily rewritten. The new rule will tip the balance back towards turfing out serious offenders, regardless of their ties to Australia, even if that upsets New Zealand. Labor has once again discovered any change to immigration rules comes with a political cost. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by James Massola, Karen Middleton and James Campbell. Very good morning to all of you. Let's start with Direction 99 and just explain it a little, James, if we can. Where did it come from and what does it actually involve?
Sure. So this was something, a direction that was rewritten by the Minister last year, partly at the urging of, or the request of Jacinda Ardern, the former New Zealand PM, who's been agitated about Kiwis who basically had spent most of their lives living here being sent back to New Zealand if they'd committed a crime. What it essentially did is say you must give preference or additional weight, if you like, to a person being allowed to stay here if they've spent the majority of their adult life, or their life, I should say, in this country. So that's, you know, in theory that sounds pretty simple. In practice, it has proved to be anything but.
There have been previous directions that do point to those ties to Australia, but this one, Karen, lifted ties to Australia to a primary consideration alongside about 4 others, including community safety.
Yeah, so the 4 others are protection of the community, whether the conduct involved family violence, the best interests of minor children involved, and community expectations, and then they plonked the strength of ties. I think it says strength, nature and duration of ties to Australia in that primary consideration.
Now, the government felt that was okay, but obviously the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, which is a quasi-judicial body where you go if someone cancels your visa, it gave a lot of weight to this ties to Australia.
The department did warn the government that when you add an extra condition like this or an extra consideration, something about the ties to Australia, there are more likely to be more people who will be able to stay as a result, who will not have their visas overturned, that the tribunal will allow to stay. And yes, the individual members of the tribunal have weighed up all of these things. And I think we do have to remember that these are people who have been convicted in a court in the judicial process and served their sentence and finished. Yeah. So this is not a re-prosecuting of the offence that they committed.
No, but some of these cases make you scratch your head, don't they?
Yeah, because there are obviously some people who've committed very serious offences, and these are members of the tribunal who are weighing up a whole range of things about whether or not they are going to pose a further risk to the community. Now, on a number of occasions they've decided they aren't. Clearly the Minister now is looking at a number of those again.
Can we just, the thing that needs to be sort of clarified, I think, is that Direction 99 was not written in the first instance as a guide for the AAT. It was written for a guide as a guide for the department.
That's right. They both use it.
To both. Yeah.
So the Bureau, and one of the things that the government was told was, well, more people are going to stay under this, so therefore we will have fewer matters in the AAT. It was meant to keep things out of the AAT. The problem was that they didn't really test it. They only tested it on 10 randomly selected cases. They did what they call a desktop exercise. And 3 of those cases, the bureaucrats warned Giles, involved serious sex and violent crimes where the perpetrator did not have family ties to Australia or did not have a substantial employment history in Australia. So you have to ask the question, were these really suitable people for them to be testing it on?
Running it on. So anyway, then we see these cases before, a stack of cases before the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, where they did decide to allow people to stay who had terrible records. But part of the big problem here is the department wasn't keeping the Minister in the loop on how all this was playing out, as we discovered.
We made a commitment to the Minister to advise him on cases that should be brought to his attention because of a number of criteria, and we have failed to do that in a timely way. So some cases have been brought to his attention.
Exactly.
Not
Exactly.
all.
And this
It's pretty serious failure.
Would Pasula have been giving that answer, do you think, if he was still around? You've got to ask the question, don't you?
It's the second time in a couple of months too, David, that's happened. Back in February we saw Home Affairs, the Minister, blindsided an estimates when Stephanie Foster tabled a document that a department had prepared, which totally wrecked Labor's day because it went to the NZYQ cohort. This is what they've done. It was, not a great look.
Is there confidence in Stephanie Foster, the Secretary of the Home Affairs Department, who's only recently sort of taken on the
There's
job?
certainly frustration that the department has contributed, shall we say, to the political position that the government is in because they didn't alert the minister to cases that may cause a problem for him because he's got discretion. So, the process is someone comes out of jail, they've served 12 months or more, that triggers the cancellation of the visa. The delegates in the department then look at that and decide if they're going to overturn it. If they say, no, we're not going to overturn it, then it goes to the AAT. But if it's a particularly egregious case, something that might raise public concerns, the department would be expected to alert the minister, hey, you might want to have another look at this. You've got discretion. Look at the decision. And that's what was failed.
Total discretion. This is the thing to understand. There's very, very little scope for decisions that are taken personally by the minister to be overturned. As we saw with the Djokovic case, the courts are extremely constrained in what they can do when the minister himself or herself has made the decision.
Well, you can go then up to the courts, but at the tribunal level, the minister can come in with a national interest ruling over the top of that. Now they have to write a new direction to clean all this up or to fix it up, presumably direction 100, I'm assuming. But look, it's not as easy as it sounds because they obviously want to shift the needle of balance back towards community safety being the primary concern, boot out more serious offenders. But you do have people who've come here as toddlers, spent decades living in Australia, done horrendous things, served their time. Are they Australia's responsibility or not?
I think they probably are. There's another complication here too, David, which is, again, the Kiwis, Christopher Luxon and, Winston Peters. They're not going to be happy if we...
This is the New Zealand Prime Minister. He has grave concerns about what Australia might do now.
Can we rewrite this? We're going to end up back where we started. New Zealanders are such hypocrites about this, though, because they have been deporting people back to Tonga, where the gang crime has increased as a result of a cohort that they've sent home from South Auckland. They're complaining that we've made their crime problem worse by sending home the 501s. They'd have a much better case if they were not doing exactly the same thing themselves.
Where's this going to land, do you think?
Well, it's a difficult challenge for the government because they can't make a New Zealand-specific direction. We have a non-discriminatory immigration system, so the direction they make, as is with the case with the current one, has to cover everybody. But the New Zealanders are clearly really laying it on and putting the pressure on. The government is saying they are going to consult them, but then that raises questions, well, why do some countries get to be consulted on our domestic law and other countries not?
Well, the majority, I guess the biggest cohort are...
And probably, the largest group who are likely to spend a lot of their time in Australia, since they were kids. Maybe there are some British citizens in the same boat. But
they're going to be quite pragmatic here, is what I understand. They're basically going to go back to what it was.
Yeah, they have to be. They're being killed by this issue.
They're talking about making sure there's an emphasis on community safety. So whether they create an extra category and sort of elevate that above the others, and I don't know.
And bump down ties to Australia.
Or maybe it's like there's two categories now: primary and other considerations. Maybe they say one primary consideration, then secondary ones, and then others.
They'd have to be quite explicit too, because clearly the tribunal didn't read the direction the way the minister expected it to be read. So maybe you do really need to spell it out.
Can I go back to the fact that what we've seen in the tribunal is the tip of the iceberg here? Because what we haven't seen yet is how this direction has been applied by the minister's delegates.
Yeah.
I think we're going to see. I would not be surprised if we see some equally, horror show decisions emerge in coming months that were not made by the AAT, but were in fact made by...
And that's the point the government's making about the time when Peter Dutton was in office. They are saying not only were similar decisions made, but they were made at the delegate level, which is effectively the minister's representative.
Can't blame the tribunal.
They're saying, hang on, it wasn't the tribunal's fault in all of those cases, it was the delegate. So I agree.
Yeah. So on the new direction they're going to write, here was Andrew Giles on what he's aiming for.
The new direction will ensure that all members of the ART will adopt a common sense approach to visa decisions, consistent with the intent of Ministerial Direction 99.
Yeah, what does common sense mean?
But Dennis Denuto been doing until now.
It's the vibe of the thing, isn't it?
And of course, he's using the term ART because they're turning the Administrative Appeals Tribunal into a new tribunal, and the legislation for that went past the Parliament this week. So they will have a whole
new set of faces there.
Yeah, but still the same old problem because it's all open to interpretation. Yeah. And while judges, when they're considering issues, are looking at black letter law, members of the tribunal are looking at the human circumstances of these people, and that makes it much more complicated.
So the reshuffle, I want to
just stay on that with the booting of the AAT and the replacement of the AR with this incoming thing. A few days ago, the Prime Minister started casting aspersions on the person, on who appointed the deputy vice president, whatever it is, of the AAT. It was a really terrible precedent for any Prime Minister to be setting, but one particularly for a bloke who's about to have 100% of the responsibility for who's sitting on the body, which is essentially the same body. Let's be clear. They have sacked one bunch of people. They're bringing in another bunch of people. They altered the terms of the employment of the people who they were getting rid of, so they don't get the redundancy they would otherwise have been entitled to, which you really have to worry about in a quasi-judicial body. They're going to every single decision that is made henceforth by these people, they're going to 100% own. And the Prime Minister, to get himself out of a tight spot a couple of weeks ago, has now created a political precedent of attacking who appointed the person who made the decision.
I want to get your thoughts on the prospects of a reshuffle. Obviously, the opposition's been piling the pressure on Andrew Giles, the Immigration Minister, to go.
Really, the only person who can take responsibility for this is ultimately Andrew Giles. And if he refuses to do so, then the Prime Minister should do so.
Well, the Prime Minister doesn't seem too keen to give the opposition a scalp on this, at least any time soon.
Andrew Giles is the Immigration Minister. I'm the Prime Minister, and I have no intentions of making changes imminent.
No imminent change. It's a rather ominous word.
That last lingering word. Look, I think a few people have said this, or observed this. I'd say it as well. The PM is a very close faction ally of Andrew Giles. He also does not want to lose any ministers. It's the longest period of a first-term government without the loss of any minister, probably, well, in fact, definitely going back to pre-John Howard days. Howard lost a lot of people in the first term. He wants to get through all the way through to the election without having lost anyone. Balancing that reality, or against that reality, if you like, though, is the fact that Giles is a man under pressure. There are some Labor people talking about a mini reshuffle in July once Parliament rises for the winter break. That could see, say, Claire O'Neill move to housing, which is, would be more cast as an economic portfolio, which is a strength of hers. Giles and Matt Keogh swapped, so Vets Affairs and Immigration, like that.
Why would you move Claire O'Neill, though? She seems to be doing okay.
Well, there's a view that you sort of clean out and start again, essentially, David. Yeah, and then you'd put her there, Julie Collins into Ag, and Murray Watt, who we'll hear from in a moment, would go into Home Affairs. He's someone who can essentially talk under water.
O'Neill's problem is she's got no mates internally. There's not a large retinue of Claire O'Neill fans inside the caucus.
I think
Giles has.
There will be a reshuffle before the end of the year. I think there will be. I think the Prime Minister doesn't want it to be precipitated by attacks on Andrew Giles. He doesn't want the opposition leader to dictate that. And he also has a view that unless you've done something really, really bad in terms of, corruption or something else.
But typically you have some who decide not to recontest the election.
That would be the trigger.
Would tell him towards the end of this year.
There will be people who will have to make a decision about their future, and I think there'll be people who will announce they're going to retire, and that will be the excuse or the trigger for a reshuffle. Yeah.
But I think it's more likely December than July. I think it's a minority who think let's get it done soon. I just don't think that.
You've got another week. You've got a whole week of Parliament to get through.
Anything could happen.
Whoever's on this couch
Not
Sunday is talking.
All right. Well, time to talk to our guest, the Agriculture Minister, Murray Watt. And to take us there, here was the then New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, raising her concerns about deportations with Anthony Albanese a couple of weeks after he was sworn in.
New Zealand is not asking for Australia to remove their deportation policy. We never have. But there are some who are being deported from Australia who, for all intents and purposes, are Australian. Often zero connection to New Zealand, sometimes not even having stepped foot there. That's the place that we're asking for that consideration to be given.
We deal with each other in a mature and a way which deals as well with common sense. And what's clear is that if people look at some of the cases that have been held, it's not surprising that the Prime Minister would make the strong representations that she had, because I would be if I was in the same position.
Murray Watt, welcome to the program.
G'day, David. Good to be with you.
So, in hindsight, should the government have ignored that pressure from New Zealand?
Well, it's obviously a matter of public record that these issues were raised by the former New Zealand Prime Minister, but what we've always said is that we will act in Australia's national interest, and that's what we have always attempted to do. As has been well canvassed over the course of this week, it was never our intention that the changes that were made to that ministerial direction would have the outcome that they did. Even the advice that Andrew Giles was provided by his department when making that direction indicated that there would be no impact on people where we were talking about serious offences having been committed. Of course, that's not the way the AAT has interpreted it. They interpreted it in a way that was never intended by the government, and that's exactly why we're now taking action to fix it.
So are you saying Direction 99 was in the national interest? What did it aim to do?
Well, obviously what it aimed to do was to recognise the difficult situation where some people involved have been in Australia for a long time, in some cases since they were a toddler or a baby, but that doesn't mean that we intended for community safety to be relegated below that as a priority. It was always our intention that community safety would be a primary consideration.
But alongside those ties to Australia, so it did elevate that issue.
It did, but what we're doing now is making it absolutely crystal clear for the AAT and departmental officials interpreting it that community safety is to be the #1 priority more than anything else.
So community safety will be a higher priority than ties to Australia?
Absolutely, and as I say, the intention was never that it would be relegated below any other factor, but what we're now doing, in light of the fact that these decisions have been made, is to make that clear. And as
so
you pointed out,
was it a mistake then, the Direction 99?
I don't think it was, because it was, as I say, the way it's been interpreted was very different to how the government intended. And what we learned through the week in Senate estimates, and you've just played in your introduction, is that Minister Giles wasn't even made aware by his department when the AAT was making decisions that went against the spirit and the intent of that direction.
And that's a whole other problem. But just to be clear on this, the government elevates ties to Australia as a top priority. Now you're going to move it down below community safety. But you still don't think that was a mistake?
What would have been a mistake is if the government had said that we want to put duration of stay above community safety, and we didn't do that.
But was it a mistake to put it alongside?
No, I don't think so. I think unfortunately the mistake has been that the AAT has interpreted that direction in a way that the government never intended. But unfortunately, this is not an issue that has just arisen on Minister Giles's watch. I mean, I think it's good that at last we've seen a bit of scrutiny of Peter Dutton's record as the Home Affairs Minister. We saw this week that over 1,300 criminals were released on his watch when he was the Home Affairs Minister. So you've got Peter Dutton out there saying that Andrew Giles should be sacked when actually Andrew Giles is cancelling visas, but at the same time Peter Dutton says that he should be made Prime Minister when he released 1,300 offenders, including over 100 sex offenders, into the community.
Yeah, and it's fair enough to point to his record, but he never elevated ties to Australia to the same level as community safety?
No, but let's have a look at what actually happened when Peter Dutton was the minister. As I say, he was the minister when 1,300 convicted criminals were released into the community with not one electronic bracelet, with not one curfew. We've actually found out today...
Understand that
well,
point.
can I just add to that, David? We've actually found out today that when it came to visa cancellations being overturned by the department, in Peter Dutton's reign, 40% of the decisions were overturned by his department. We've nearly halved that. So we've deported more criminals in our first year at office than the government ever did under Peter Dutton's reign. The department at the time Peter Dutton was the minister was overturning visa cancellations at double the rate our government has done. And of course we've put in place further protections that were never employed by Peter Dutton when he was the minister.
Sorry, I think you just said you've deported more criminals than he ever did. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely correct. What the government has done in our first year of office is deport more criminals than happened in the previous year under the former government.
Clear that up. Not in total, though. Now, this new direction that you're talking about that will make community safety number one, ties to Australia number two. What does that mean for someone who came here as a toddler, as you say? I mean, there's this terrible example of 74-year-old Charles William Davidson came here when he was 5 from Scotland. I mean, that was back when Winston Churchill was still Prime Minister. So he spent a long time in Australia, obviously done some terrible things, been convicted of horrendous offences, sexually assaulting 26 women and girls and so on. Is he Australia's problem?
I don't think he should be Australia's problem, and that is made clear by the fact that this whole case, along with all of the other cases, arose in the context where the government decided to cancel people's visas, including that person's visa. Presumably they appealed it to a department for reconsideration. That was knocked back. They then appealed it to the AAT, where the government opposed their application, and the AAT nevertheless decided to revoke that cancellation. So the point is that at every step of the way, the government has indicated that people like that do not belong in Australia.
So even if you come here as a 5-year-old and spend 70 years here, you're out.
Well, I think that the Australian community expects that community safety will be the number one priority, and that's exactly what's being made clear through this change to the direction.
Can you clear up another thing for us? The Immigration Minister said the other day on Sky News that drones are being used to monitor some of those released from immigration detention after the High Court ruling. It does seem a little bit fanciful that there are drones buzzing over our heads, keeping an eye on some people. Is that really happening?
Well, my understanding is that drones are being used as part of this operation, but more in the sense of monitoring the accommodation that people are living in and, for example, ensuring that it's not too close to schools or other areas that they're not supposed to be living close to. So drones do form part of the operation that's involved in monitoring those offenders, but it's being done in an operational sense like that.
You could use Google Maps to find out whether someone's house is too close to a school. Are drones seriously being used for this?
That's my understanding, David, is to monitor the location and the accommodation of these offenders.
Right. But are they watching the offenders as well as they wander around the streets?
Well, my understanding is it's more about mapping the location in the sense of the accommodation of the offender, and particularly in relation to areas that they legislatively can't be near.
You're right across these immigration and home affairs issues, Murray Watt, which prompts the question, are you interested at all in taking on either role?
I'm actually really enjoying my current role, David. I'm obviously very privileged to serve in the Cabinet and really enjoying the role of agriculture, fisheries, forestry and emergency management. But more than that, I actually really support my colleagues and what they've been doing.
So how would you rate the performance of Andrew Giles?
I think that Andrew Giles and Claire O'Neill have both performed incredibly strongly in a really difficult portfolio area. We need to remember the mess that they inherited when we came to office. I mean, basically they inherited a massive battleship that was off course and that had been torpedoed full of holes. They've had to patch that up over the time that they've been the ministers.
We've also seen a lot of political difficulties, as I'm sure you would acknowledge. If the PM were to say to you, I need you as one of our stronger performers to go into one of these roles, would you do it?
Look, I'm not even thinking about that, David. As I say, I enjoy the role that I've got at the moment and I really back in my colleagues. I think they've had a very difficult role fixing up the mess that Peter Dutton left. I mean, remember the migration review that was led by Martin Parkinson, the former head of Prime Minister and Cabinet under Malcolm Turnbull, said willful neglect over 10 years.
OK, no, we've heard that point. I've also heard you might be interested in the Attorney General's job at some point down the track.
Oh, look, you can throw any portfolio in.
Okay. I got to try.
My answer's going to be the same.
Let's talk about your portfolio then, Minister. China has lifted sanctions on about 5 beef exporters. Most of the trade bans that were imposed a few years ago have now been removed. I think lobster's the only one left. What is your advice to beef, wine, other exporters now about getting back into the Chinese market? Should they really have diversified more? Is there still a risk in chasing that lucrative market in China?
Well, I think it is terrific news that again this week we saw the lifting of further trade suspensions by China, David, and I think this demonstrates that the work that our government has put in to stabilise the relationship with China is paying real dividends for our farmers, our processors, the whole Australian community. Individual companies will make their own decisions about what they do, but I think that people have learned the lesson of putting too many eggs in one basket, whether it be China or any other market. I mean, I can very much understand why producers would be wanting to get back into the China market. It is our biggest agricultural trading partner, and even in the few months that we've seen some of those barriers lifted, that has generated about $3 billion more exports for our agriculture sector than what we had before. So things like barley, wine, cotton, hay, timber logs, and now beef establishments as well. So it is a very high value market, but what we've also been trying to do over the last couple of years is diversify markets. We've actually opened dozens of new markets around the world, whether it be stone fruit going into Vietnam, wine into India, barley into the Middle East and other markets as well. So I think diverse markets is the future, but I can understand why people are keen to get back into China.
But your advice as Minister is for exporters to diversify.
I wouldn't go that far, David. I wouldn't take it upon myself to advise individual companies about what's in their commercial interests, but I think that people should be thinking about, the degree to which they're exposed to any one market. You know, over the last few years, we've seen all sorts of supply chain interruptions.
China's the one that we've seen can turn off the tap. It can really wreck. It can really punish an industry. They need to be aware of that, don't they?
Yeah, but they obviously need to be aware of that. But again, I think many companies are already getting back into China. And as I say, those figures demonstrate the value of doing so. But I think a lot of companies will be also thinking about making sure they've got other options available too.
All right, live sheep, big protest held in Perth just on Friday. More are planned. This is over your plans to, your announced decision to ban live sheep exports in 4 years' time. Look, the industry says the problems that were there were about 7 years ago. They've cleaned everything up since then. Have they?
Well, I don't think that they have done enough to meet community standards, and I think the community's been very clear about this industry. I mean, we need to understand that live sheep exports by sea has been an industry in decline for about 20 years under both sides of politics. It's now worth less than 1% of Western Australia's agricultural production, and at the same time, we've seen exports of sheep meat that's processed here in Australia just go through the roof with more demand every single day. So really what we're trying to do through this decision is to stop jobs being sent offshore and actually create jobs onshore through more onshore processing. Sure,
and that's what the funding will go to. They dispute that the industry's, in decline, as you say. They say it still has it should have a future. What are the issues, the problems that are still there?
Well, I think if you look at the mortality figures, they are still significantly higher than live cattle exports, which is one of the reasons that the government doesn't support banning live cattle exports.
Because the industry says they're not. They're the same as live cattle.
No, the figures are still higher for sheep. But as I say, this is an industry that lost community support a long time ago. Even surveys that have been conducted in Western Australia, the only state that's doing this now, show that about 70% of Western Australians support this trade being ended, and they support the idea of moving towards more onshore processing, which is more jobs and more exports for Australia.
Your support package has been described by the West Australian Labor Premier, Roger Cook, as not good enough. Will you offer any more?
Oh, look, I would understand why the Western Australian Premier has been saying this, but we think that this is a really substantial package. As I say, this is an industry that's been in decline a long time. It's never been given a cent by any government to transition. We're now offering over $100 million in taxpayer funding to help this industry rebuild itself towards more onshore processing. Yeah, I mean, that's the offer that's there, and we think that will go a long way. And as I say, I think that's why we don't need to despair about the sheep industry in general. It will have a different future, but it will have a strong future.
Finally, Murray Watt, do you think a company tax cut should be considered?
No, that's not on the government's agenda, David. Obviously, we've got a full range of different tax measures in place at the moment. Most importantly, the tax cuts that will come in for every single Australian taxpayer on the 1st of July.
So what's Ed Husick talking about, your cabinet colleague, when he says it should be considered?
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, obviously Ed's made those remarks, but the government's policy is that we've got a big range of tax measures on the place. Our focus is on multinational tax avoidance. We've made the changes to the PRRT, and of course we've put forward the tax credits.
So definitely
in the future made in Australia.
no consideration of a company tax cut.
No, certainly nothing that I've been involved in, and the tax credits that are going towards the future made in Australia is the primary vehicle for this, and of course they're being opposed by Peter Dutton and the opposition.
All right. Murray Watt, Minister for Agriculture and Emergency Management, and happy in that role, as he's told us. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thanks, David.
All right. We will talk about Ed Husick's comments on company tax. It doesn't sound like there's going to be a lot of movement on that from the government, but what was behind these comments from a fellow Cabinet Minister? First, let's continue this conversation with our panel, James Massola, Karen Middleton and James Campbell. Look, just quickly to recap on immigration. I think we got a bit more clarity there from the Minister on where they're going to go now with the new direction, James?
Yeah, that's right, giving preference to community safety, as we were discussing while watching. Yeah, that being the first order of business.
But there's an interesting point to pick up on here, and I think this is where maybe there's been some confusion. So those primary considerations are listed and numbered, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what the new government did when it came in was it slotted the time spent in Australia in at number 3. According to what Murray Watt said, they clearly have in their mind that both the departmental delegates and the AAT will have them in a ranking order.
But they're all primary considerations.
But the direction doesn't actually say that. The numbers might imply it, but the direction doesn't say it. It gives them equal weight. It does say one or more primary considerations may outweigh other primary considerations, and my understanding is, at least at the delegate level, they were looking at them all as having equal weight.
Anyway, look...
It is the vibe of the thing.
Exactly. It needs to be explicit, doesn't it? Yeah. But he also made it very clear, if you come here as a 4 or 5-year-old, even if you spend 70 years here doing, you're out.
And they've also said they're going to elevate the issue of the impact on victims. Now, that's one of the other considerations later on. It sounds like that might be elevated too.
All right. Now, I want to talk about the redistribution. It's a draft redistribution from the Electoral Commission at this stage. Came on Friday. We get these every parliamentary term. The final decision will be made towards the end of the year, I think October. So there's 2 states affected here. We'll come to WA. But let's talk about Victoria. The seat of Higgins would go, currently held by Labor's Michelle Ananda-Rajah. That seat abolished. Kooyong takes in part of that. James, this brings Josh Frydenberg potentially into the mix because that was his seat. Monique Ryan, the Teal Independent, currently holds it. Liberals have already pre-selected Amelia Hamer, 30-year-old Oxford graduate, impressive young candidate. But the boundary change does mean you've got a lot of Liberal members who didn't get a say on that. Does the committee, the Liberal Party Administrative Committee, reopen the pre-selection?
There's another factor, which is that the Liberals had also pre-selected Dr. Katie Allen.
In Higgins.
Yeah. Now, she will have a reasonable argument that the new Kooyong is in fact a substantially, at least half of Kooyong. At least half of Higgins, sorry. Yeah. Most of the Liberal members...
We're talking about parts like
most of the Liberal Party members probably live in Higgins. Yeah. So she has a case that she should be, if there's going to be a reopening, she would want to put her hand.
So you've got 3 potential
three potentials. We've got 3 candidates. We've got Josh sitting on the sidelines, tying up his laces, doing his stretches, but he hasn't quite decided really what he wants to do. We've got Amelia Hamer, who's won the lotto here because the new seat, Kooyong, is much more winnable for the Liberal Party than the old Kooyong, which I should say, by the way, the Liberals are overall gutted about this because they thought the seat that they were most likely to win in Victoria was Higgins. If it had been lost to a Teal, it would have been a problem. But because it was lost to a Labor MP, they think their conventional weapons will work on her.
Yeah, still, they might get Kooyong back now with this redistribution. But
most people I talk to in the Liberal Party don't think that Amelia Hamer is going to beat Monique Ryan.
Would Josh Frydenberg, though?
A few problems for Josh Frydenberg. Would Peter Dutton want Josh Frydenberg back right at this moment with his ambitions to lead in the future?
He can't say that.
No, of course he can't say that.
But a bigger problem is elbowing aside a younger female candidate.
There's another problem in relation to Josh Frydenberg. He wasn't willing to put his hand up when the seat was a little bit harder to win, but he wants it reopened now that it's going to be a little bit easier to win. Is that an argument? And then there's the argument about women, and that makes it very complicated because they still have a problem with women and representation of women and the whole issue around women. And I think that's going to make it a very tough decision if they are going to look at reopening it.
If it's not just, if there's an argument to be made for Josh coming back now that's not just about, oh, I like these boundaries a bit better than the old ones, it's that October 7th has happened and it's clearly re-engaged and energised him in the foreign policy space, which is where he really came from before he...
And I'm just suggesting that some of his critics might make that argument.
Monique Ryan absolutely would. But not to mention, you know, they need a bit more firepower on their front bench, right? And there's a former treasurer, former deputy leader who's got, you know, the record as a treasurer.
Of course, but you've got to have an argument for why now, right? And the why now is, I think, the world is a much more dangerous place. He would argue, I suspect, that, you know, for whatever reason, he's
needed.
He's needed. Yeah, now is the time for him. He thinks that he can turn around what he would regard, and a lot of people.
James, what do you think? It's not without some messiness.
It would be an appalling look for Josh Frydenberg to come in now. Now, Amelia Hamer, really, she has a terrific CV. She herself is a future cabinet minister. Just because it's gotten a bit easier, the bloke wants to come back in. So the Liberals I've spoken to in the last 24 hours, very senior in the party, in the parliamentary wing of the party, are saying we really need to think carefully before doing it.
They're hardly disinterested, though,
No, but that's exactly what I've picked up as well. There are some women in particular who are worried about
they've made
how this
such a solid dance about getting more women into Parliament. They've set up, you know, the sort of Margaret Guilfoyle network. Suddenly, when it looks like an easier seat to win, we'll get the bloke back in.
Now, anyway, it's going to be fascinating.
Think about what Monique Ryan would do with this too.
Well, that's what I mean. Yeah. Anyway, dilemma for the Administrative Committee to decide whether to open that up or not. Just quickly, the other changes in Victoria make Deakin and Menzies, the Liberals' two last Melbourne seats. Deakin goes to 0, I think, for Michael Sukkar, and Menzies is now notionally Labor for Liberals.
And remember, Labor nearly took Menzies at the last election, which shocked everybody because Menzies being the sort of totemic blue ribbon seat named after Menzies. I think that Labor, even though they're losing a seat, and that's very disappointing for Michelle and Andaraja, overall they're doing all right out of that redistribution.
And they gain in WA.
And they gain in WA, and there are a couple of other interesting things in WA, like I think Andrew Hastie's seat, who of course is also a prominent member of the coalition, his seat margin is pared back, and a number of others. So, you know, overall I think Labor would look at this and say, you know, not too bad.
The only downside, there's one downside where I live, poor old Peter Khalil has taken in Trot Central, like the green heartland.
And he's in trouble anyway.
He's in all sorts of bother anyway.
Well, the Greens are running.
Greens leader from Victoria, Samantha Ratnam, is running against him. Peter Khalil is in trouble anyway.
Max Chandler Mather's been running door-knocking campaigns and training events for that seat and Cooper more than a year ago.
Pouring a fair bit in there.
But also, October, he's another victim of October 7th.
That worked in Queensland.
We've got to move on. The economy, we saw, have a look at these monthly inflation figures. Yes, the monthly ones bounce around a bit, but have a look. You can see when Labor came in, inflation was a lot higher, absolutely. But in those last few months, on the right-hand side there, you can see just those monthly numbers are ticking up in the wrong direction. Inflation going a little higher. Not a huge bounce at all, but it's that trend line. And look, the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, is not what he wants to see, but he is confident the measures he announced in the budget a couple of weeks ago will help.
When we came to office, inflation had a 6 in front of it, Mr. Speaker, and now it has a 3 in front of it. It has moderated overall, but we need it to moderate further and faster. And that's why the budget had such a big focus on fighting inflation and easing cost of living pressures.
Yeah, what do you think? You'll be really hoping that $300 energy rebate works to push down inflation.
Yeah, so a couple of interesting data points we'll see this week, David. National wage review, annual wage review comes out tomorrow. Right. That'll probably come in at roughly the rate of inflation like it did last year, so 3.6%. Then the national accounts on Wednesday. Now, the government is expecting there'll be some growth, it'll be sluggish, and they're going to pivot to an argument about see, we actually got it right with the budget. We're making these long-term investments. Inflation will come down in the next 6 months. Then we're going to have a growth problem. That's why Future Made in Australia is doing its job. That's why we've made these other investments. So I think that'll be very much part of the focus in Parliament this week.
Yeah, all right. And
this is an opportunity, though, for the coalition, because if it's starting to ramp up now, it might start to give their line that this is inflation made in Australia some traction. But the bigger and more politically scary thing for the government from these numbers is what is the impact, the kind of zeitgeist going to do when it really dawns on people that interest rates are staying at the level they are for a long time? 3 or 4 months ago, I think we were all in our minds thinking, oh, yeah, this is bad.
Now,
but by the end of the year, by Christmas, things are going to be starting up. Now, we're halfway through the year. There's no sign that it's going to ease up.
We may yet see a fall by the end of the year, but it'll probably be later on now. So the government would be very much with the political lens that they'll put on it. They'll be hoping that those rates are starting to come down over the new year, if that's when they're going to go to an election.
But the point is, though,
the commentary's been about where rates will go, though. I mean, we saw 0.1% move last month in inflation. That's not a big jump in inflation. Now, you'd want it trending down.
But you've got to understand, people's household savings are going, right? They could, a year ago, I mean, I don't know what your experience is, but 12 months ago, people I was talking to who, you know, as you would imagine, being at, you know, above average income, right, thought that these sorts of interest rate rises, they were sort of watching them like they're happening over there. Now,
because they had a buffer.
Because they had a buffer, and the buffer's gone now, and it's the hot button talk about.
I want to get your thoughts too on these comments mentioned with Murray Watt from Ed Husick when it comes to considering at least a cut in the company tax rate.
That is something long term I think does need to be considered, and we're probably in a better space to consider that.
A better space, he says, because we've had some real wage growth, and the trade-off could be giving business a company tax cut. You know, not going to happen by the sounds of what Murray Watt and the Treasurer have said. What's going on here? Why is the Cabinet Minister saying that?
Well, I think the subtext is that Ed Husick's got concerns, clearly from the way he expressed it, about growth. And are we going to be growing quickly enough? I mean, James just talked about the sluggish growth. That is a problem. It's flatlining.
Is it also a concern that the Future Made in Australia plan isn't enough?
Well, the implication is there, right? He may not have said it directly, but if he's still concerned about growth, he's suggesting that what they're doing now isn't going to do enough for growth. And certainly the whole reason we have the Future Made in Australia strategy is to encourage private investment to invest in clean energy in Australia. Well, that implies private investment isn't keen to do it by itself. So, you know, the picture here is that a lot needs to be done to encourage growth, and I think that's the undercurrent there in Ed Husick.
Is there something bigger here too about Ed Husick and how he's positioned in the Cabinet?
Husick's a bit of a lone wolf, and that, for me, he's that Cabinet Minister who, like John Button, let's say 30, 35 years ago, speaks out. Also an industry minister.
Old school industry policy.
Yeah, indeed. He speaks out, he speaks his mind. Very few people in the Cabinet do that. I think there's a subtext there in that was a bit of a tanks on the lawn moment. There's been a bit of a jostle between Chalmers and Husick over who controls what in the Future Made in Australia pot of money. So that's Ed kind of pushing back. But to Karen's point, he also has a view that, you know, on the one hand, wages have started to get moving, you know, much to Tony Burke's delight. So therefore, the government actually has a duty to give something back. Australia's business tax rate is, I think it's second or third highest in the OECD after Norway, unsurprisingly. Right. So that has to come back down at some point.
The Coalition, of course, argues the way to get the economy really going and fix up our energy woes is nuclear power. We're yet to see the details, as we've said a few times on the program. I did catch up, though, with Tony Barry and Cos Samaras from Redbridge this week about their latest polling and research post-budget and so on. And look, they've also been looking at how nuclear policy is going down, and safe to say it's not going down well.
We've done about 20 sort of focus groups on energy in general. What comes up without fail is references to The Simpsons, which is phenomenal when you think about it, a cultural icon. But the three-eyed fish comes up almost every single time.
Is that right? Because you sort of you hear this sometimes, but that's actually what people bring 100%. Up when you talk about nuclear power.
100%, yeah, it's extraordinary. I thought the first 3 times was just an incredible coincidence.
You can listen to that podcast. Use the QR codes there for iView or the ABC Listen app. Find it in your podcast stream. Look, the three-eyed fish, Blinky, for Simpsons fans might remember. It tells us why Labor are focused very heavily on the question of location of nuclear sites. And James, you spoke to the PM about this as well.
Yeah, I had a chat to the PM yesterday about this. He ran the campaign in 2007 when he was Shadow Infrastructure Minister for Kevin Rudd against John Howard's plans. And he's rubbing his hands together and saying, we will fight them on this every day from now until the election. So Labor's view is, essentially his view is, this is, you know, it's almost like the voice in reverse. Do you support, you know, making the lives of Indigenous Australians better? Yes. But then when we got down to the nitty-gritty, you know, the support fell away. Similarly, do you support nuclear power? Yes. Do you want it next to you? Hell no. Yeah. That's the opportunity.
I thought in your story there was a killer line too from, was it from Labor? I don't know.
An unnamed Labor MP about, well, you know, wait till we get to the point where we start talking about handing out free iodine tablets to anyone who lives within 100 k's.
There is another element here too. You know, going in the coalition's favour is, yes, when you poll people and say, would you think about nuclear now, given the energy situation we're in? They say yes, and that's what the coalition is hanging on to. But when you say to them, but do you know that nuclear power would take 15 years and cost billions and billions of dollars? They say no. So it isn't just the very potent three-eyed fish thing, and do you want Fukushima next door to you kind of thing. It's also, it will take a long time and cost a lot. So there's a pragmatic argument that isn't about that scare campaign thing that is also resonating. And I think there's two problems there for the coalition.
I don't understand as well. This is a point a Nats MP made to me the other day. Now, they've got a potent campaign going against renewables, the 28,000 kilometres or whatever it is of poles and wires that are going to go up. Why would someone living in Armidale, who is not okay with that rollout or the solar farm, why would they be okay with the nuclear power?
Barnaby Joyce reckons so.
You were sitting here and I'm sitting there. Yeah. Like this is a problem. I mean, I've been consistent about this. I think it's politically nuts. I thought it was politically nuts from the get-go. And that doesn't change the fact, though, that what's interesting is that the government is grasping at this like a drowning man because they're not going to be building their re-election campaign around their record, are they? Because on the issue that the public say they care the most about, which is the drop in the standard of living and the cost of living crisis, what do you want to call it, polls are starting to show that most people think the government's done nothing or very little or nothing for them, and they've almost given up on that. So what are they? They're going to have to make this a referendum about Dutton, and Dutton appears to be, at the moment, walking into that trap.
And they've shifted, the Labor Party has shifted its strategy this week. You know, you've seen them starting to attack, and the Prime Minister and others starting to attack Peter Dutton directly. Now, Prime Ministers generally avoid doing that because it elevates the opposition leader to the same status as the Prime Minister. But when you get within proximity of an election, they have to do it. And what we heard in the briefing out of the Labor caucus this week was the phrase that Anthony Albanese said to his colleagues, the Cabinet is focused on crafting the offer for a second term. Now, that's campaign speak for presenting what we are and comparing it with what they are. And what they're starting to do with Peter Dutton is now make people think about him as an alternative Prime Minister, because their research is suggesting when he is a critic of the government, he is very effective on things like immigration, and what we've seen, he's done very, very well on that. But when people start to see him as an alternative Prime Minister and weigh him up like that, he struggles a bit, and that goes to the personal poll ratings too.
We've got to move on. Look, we haven't even had a chance to talk about Donald Trump, but I reckon in the next 6 months we'll have plenty of chances to talk about Donald Trump, and lots of commentary about that going on. All right, our panel, James Campbell, Karen Middleton and James Massola, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with the creator of a new arts program for the ABC, The Art of, Zoe Norton-Lodge. What's it about?
Well, The Art of is answering life's big questions through the lens of arts. Going to be airing from this Tuesday night.
One of the first episodes is, can art mend a broken heart?
Yeah.
Andrew Giles, the Minister for Immigration, might need... Did you interview him? He's been under huge pressure.
He has been under huge pressure. He must have a very breaking heart.
David Rowe has perfectly depicted him as Get Smart, Andrew Giles. Hello, 99. I think he's using Peter Dutton's immigration shoe phone here.
Are you concerned that our pop culture references are from 1965? Like, we could have gone with 99 Problems.
But it does fit, like he's very Get Smart-ish. I hope there's a cone of silence in the opposition leaders' rooms, right?
I reckon so.
Brett Lethbridge has got Direction 99 right out in the wilderness here, blamed for immigration debacle.
Yes.
My department, Home Affairs Department, Peter Dutton, AAT.
Yeah. Direction 99 just means there's 99 different directions we can blame for this complete debacle.
Lovely David Pope inheriting the Mecca department. Oh my goodness, no, Mr Giles, this was only ever designed as cosplay to keep Peter occupied, says Malcolm Turnbull.
It was never equipped for actual policy. Yeah. Cartoonists are often quite mean about the way they draw Peter Dutton, but that one's quite accurate.
It really is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Alex Ellinghausen's pictures of him, even on a very good day, Andrew Giles' resting face is bunny in the headlights.
Yeah.
Kathy Wilcox has got Peter Dutton. This government has demonstrated its weakness, showing tolerance to criminal non-citizens instead of deporting them.
At least when we did the exact same thing in government, we were competent enough not to get found out.
That is the art of politics, isn't it?
Oh, it is the God-given right of the opposition to accuse somebody of doing something that you definitely did 2 years ago.
And the opposition here were certainly in their element during the week. Warren Brown, clearly the minister has the public support as they seem to be having him on a stick burning him.
They do. Well, I just hope that they're citizens, because if they're not, they might get deported under Direction 99, if I understood it from my reading.
Zoe, from the political battlefield to the home front, a lot of people are fighting to just keep a roof over their heads.
I know.
Megan Herbert's done this lovely... I really did like this cartoon. Like all politicians, they're very wordy about things. She's used the words to build a bit of a shelter here. We know you're doing it tough. People are hurting. We know how hard it is. The system is broken.
Yeah, it's stunning. And after they've made that tent, they can use the leftover words to make a word salad to eat, because... that's the state of the cost of living these days.
Peter Brollman, so housing is crucial to defending Australia.
I wish they'd tell the Reserve Bank that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what these guys are complaining about. Like, any millennial will be thrilled for this house. Look at it, it's got a separate kitchen. Yeah. This is the Australian dream. They've got a lamp.
Quite a historic moment in the US as Donald Trump was the first former president to be a convicted felon.
Yeah, it's quite astounding, isn't it?
Yeah. He's going to be sentenced just a few days before he becomes officially the nominee for president for the Republican Party.
They don't have to structure it quite so much like a perfect Hollywood movie.
If you wrote this script, people would go, nah.
Yeah, they'd be like, it's ridiculous.
This is from a Swiss cartoonist, Zoe, Patrick Chapate. He's got the press conference here in the big house through the phone.
Yeah, and all the adoring fans there wanting to talk to him. Apparently some sort of system was broken for donating to him as soon as he was convicted.
Really?
Yeah.
I feel like it needs a Morgan Freeman narrative, you know.
Oh, it will get one. It's one thing we'll get out of this. We're going to get eventually some incredible films.
Zoe, The New Yorker has already published its cover for next week, and
Wow.
it's a John Kineo illustration of trying to put the cuffs on the little hands here.
Yeah, it's almost like they might slip out of those giant cuffs and he might just get on with things as he will.
Adam Zeigler from the Buffalo News has got Donald Trump trying to pull over Lady Justice, and it pins his tie here.
Yeah, he almost got away with it, but just got pinned by that silly long tie he always wears. That's his problem, his long tie.
Look, it's been a great pleasure unpicking the events this week.
Thanks for having me.
I'll let you do the honours.
Back to you, Spearsy.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Mike. Donald Trump, the gift to cartoonists everywhere, no doubt about it. Time for some final observations. Quick one from me. It now looks almost certain there will be no religious discrimination law or change to the Sex Discrimination Act happening in this term of Parliament. Mark Dreyfus and Michaelia Cash met the other day. It did not go well, to put it mildly. The government's, or the Prime Minister's always said he wants bipartisanship on this. Doesn't look like it's happening. I think he has technically said he could work with the Greens or crossbench, but I don't think he wants to. So it doesn't look like they will, in this term of Parliament, get round to that religious discrimination law or Sex Discrimination Act, despite the concerns of equality advocates about gay kids and teachers. James?
I think there is concern, I wouldn't say it's, I don't know, it's rising slowly about some of the media performances of the Prime Minister. He seems a bit distracted, a bit meandering. There's a view he's not being briefed as well as he was when his former staffer Liz Fitch was doing the job. There's also a view forming, I think, that he's doing too many, not very, he needs to cut back on the FMs and sort of constant appearances and be a bit more prime ministerial.
Karen.
Government's announced it's putting legislation in Parliament this week to outlaw sharing deep fake pornographic images, so images that are created by artificial intelligence and other forms of technology. 6 years jail for that, and an extra year if you happen to be the person who shares it and who also created it. But it is a sharing offence. That's all they can do under Commonwealth law. It's still not illegal to actually create the image. That is something that has to happen, be outlawed at the state and territory level. I'm told there's a bit of work going on there, but over to them, that's the next step.
All right, James.
Anthony Albanese keeps saying he's a full-termer. I'm not so sure, and neither are some of the members of his cabinet. There's a few things in play that could mean a December election this year, some of them including a Donald Trump win, a Queensland Labor loss, people having tax cuts still jangling in their pockets after 6 months, and maybe inflation starts to come off to the point where we get a rate cut in November. If that happens, I wouldn't rule out an early poll.
All right, thank
and
you
a
all.
PM wedding soon after.
Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, whoever sits in the Speaker's chair is usually there to ensure a certain standard of decorum. But sometimes parliamentary procedures can be just so frustrating. We'll leave you with this bleeped out version of Scott Buchholz. Thanks for watching.
The question is now that the bill be read a second time, this is as we shift over to the National Disability Insurance Amendment. Call the clerk.
Government business, order of the day number 1. National Disability Insurance Scheme Amendment.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.